Hi there, it's Katie Crysdale here from Lakeview Aquatic Consultants. Welcome back, or welcome if you are new here. So each week, I like to take a couple minutes and talk about our weekly newsletter. If you don't subscribe to our newsletter, it comes out each Wednesday throughout the year with a couple of breaks for holidays. And in that newsletter, my goal is to share all the news that crossed my desk in the course of a week. And that is going to be a mixture of different news stories ranging from aquatic facilities, new projects, lawsuits, trends that I'm seeing, and I try and provide some interpretation about why I think these stories matter, what they say about the state of the aquatic facility industry, whether you are working as a hotel pool operator, a municipal pool manager, a lifeguard, a swim instructor. I know all of you have different roles and all of you read the newsletter for different reasons. The reason for the audio or the visual version of the newsletter is because lots of you have said that you don't have the opportunity to add another newsletter to your inbox each week. So we are going to chat about the majority of the articles that I shared in this week's newsletter. And then if there's anything specific that you want to dive into further, you can access each individual newsletter article in the link in the description box below. So you can access the newsletter and then click on any individual link that you find helpful. So let us get started. Today, I'm going to be talking about the December 3rd, 2025 newsletter. So this came out yesterday. And in this newsletter, I did use a little bit of a clickbait subject line because I did talk about profit being treated as though it's more important than aquatic facility accessibility. I don't use clickbait lightly, but there's been a saga over the last couple of weeks, particularly with SeaWorld. SeaWorld is a dry amusement park down in Orlando. And when I was at IAPA a couple of weeks ago, this initial news story came out where the staff at SeaWorld, administration, they said they were no longer going to allow rolling walkers with seats. So this might be something where you've seen individuals in the grocery store, at the airport, people who are not able to stand for long periods of time and who use a walker as a mobility aid. They have a bench on which they can sit, or a lady can put her purse, a guy can put his groceries. They're pretty common out in the real world. And SeaWorld made a pretty big statement a couple of weeks ago and said that they were no longer going to be permitted in their amusement park. And what I said at the time when I posted this on Facebook was that this is extremely short-sighted and only a decision that could have been made by somebody who is completely able-bodied and respectfully out of touch with the reality that people who need mobility devices with benches to sit down. And so I didn't provide that context at the time in the Facebook post because I was at IAPA, I was really busy. But a better formulated thought would be to explain that if you are not able-bodied, so for example, when I travel and I walk with my husband, who does have two very bad knees at this point, he's scheduled for full knee replacements in 2026. The world is hostile in terms of architecture and design, and we are often in lines in places like at the bank. He recently told me he'd gone to the bank on my behalf while I was busy, and that the normal kind of fence, the corral to stand in line, which is bolted to the ground, it was under repair. It had been removed, so there was nothing that he could lean against. And the day he went to the bank, that it was there was a lengthy wait, and he had to stand upright for 25 or 30 minutes. And he mentioned this in passing. Hey, I need to sit down. My knees are swollen because I had to stand up to see the bank teller. All of this is a long way of saying that when SeaWorld came out and said, hey, we're no longer going to allow rolling walkers, I was not at all surprised that this was going to cause huge public backlash, because if you need a place to sit, that's why you use a rolling walker with a bench, so you can sit down when you need to take a load off. Then last week, this is the article that I shared in the newsletter, the Department of Justice, which is the main body in the United States that regulates the Americans with Disabilities Act, they did open an investigation as to whether this might be in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which provides people access to facilities in different manners. And they were very clear that this is not a charge. There are no fines. There is no finding of wrongdoing as of yet. But they did ask SeaWorld to clarify their position and why this is necessary, so forth and so forth. Then SeaWorld came out with a statement saying why they feel the need to have this change in policy. And I thought it was really funny because just around the same time this week, Universal Orlando, a competing park in the same area, decided to roll out an updated, very welcoming accessibility program. So this whole thing has been somewhat of a mess, and I'm not surprised because I've been in the private sector now for long enough as a consultant that I have seen repeatedly now customers for whom I have directed them, hey, your facility is not accessible. Hey, this part of your facility is not accessible. Hey, did you realize that you didn't provide access to this type of user and this type of user? And repeatedly now over the last few years, again, of working in the private sector, I've left the ivory tower and I've had properties, most notably private properties. I'm not going to get more specific than that. They've said, yeah, we don't care. We don't have to be accessible. Yeah, we know that those type of people are not going to come to our aquatic facility. And it's just so bizarre and infuriating and surprising because accessibility is profitable. And as I shared further down in the newsletter, a 1-star bad review from a local facility that was recently trolled for not being accessible. I do understand that there are old buildings that are not accessible, like a Victorian home with lots of stairs to enter the building. But when it comes to new facilities that I work with or facilities that have a choice, I find it really interesting that they come to the conclusion that they shouldn't try, or when they can't be accessible, that they're not doing alternative remediation in terms of education or signage or information on their website. I mean, this could be a whole series of newsletters, but what I really wanted to highlight in the December 3rd newsletter is that accessibility should not be at the cost of profit, i.e., or I guess the reverse, like I've said it wrong. Profit should not be prioritized over accessibility, or accessibility, I guess one way of thinking about it is seen as a cost to profit. And so businesses or companies or corporations decide not to pursue it. And I'm not even myself disabled. I'm able-bodied. I simply live with someone who's gotten increasingly disabled. And, you know, he doesn't need a wheelchair. There's lots of things he still can do. So I find it so interesting that we're seeing the advancement in some ways. For example, in autism awareness, more and more airports that I travel through, they have programs to assist children or families with autistic children, special lines, special sensory rooms, and signage that says you don't have to disclose your disability. And yet we're missing some of the most basic accessibility when it comes to things like walkers, wheelchairs, strollers, canes, etc. So let me know in the comments below what you think. Is this me reading too much into things? SeaWorld is just one company. They can dig their own hole. Or are you seeing a wider trend in your region or in your area? I do know in talking with Kate Connell earlier this year when we talked about equitable aquatic training, specifically first aid, she did mention to me that there is kind of this trend to be somewhat binary or to be somewhat contrarian, that there can be a contraction in certain regions or certain types of facilities in the perception of some of these equity initiatives. So maybe that's the case in your area. Maybe this has become divisive. Maybe this is seen adjacent to DEI in a way that people are pulling back. But I will definitely say that for myself, I was not altogether surprised to see that the Department of Justice is investigating SeaWorld. And I will be interested to see where this goes, because they definitely did not put out a press release pulling back on the policy. They definitely didn't change the policy or mitigate the policy. It appears to still be in place. I'm not in Florida, so I don't know the amount of backlash. I wasn't able to find a ton of bad reviews on Google or anything like that, but I'm also not on Reddit boards or other locations where people might be discussing their needs in more depth. So that was basically the bulk of the op-ed in this week's newsletter, is really considering how is your facility being used? Every facility has the opportunity to increase access, whether that is through the traditional methods that I've been talking about, like ramps, transfer walls, accessibility lifts, chairs, those sorts of things. But also in terms of accessibility, there's other forms to think about, right? How well lit is your facility in terms of people who may have visual impairment? What about people from other cultures with different languages? What about accessibility in terms of modesty needs or religious needs or cultural needs? And it is definitely a challenge depending on where you are based. There may be lots of different things to consider. But as Kate Connell said in our chat a few weeks ago, starting somewhere with one thing is also good enough. Don't get overwhelmed and prevent you from starting at all, right? You have to start somewhere. In terms of the news articles this week, the things that crossed my desk, it was definitely more of a spread of different projects and different things that are going on as 2025 wraps up. We are definitely starting to see project delays, I would say, broadly within the industry. I don't know if that is going back to tariffs, supply chain, the economy, industry, shipping, right? There's still lots of shipping, transportation issues around the world, whether it's in the Red Sea with the Houthis or in terms of hurricanes and all of that. But a couple of the stories that I mentioned in this week's newsletter included delays to the Royal Caribbean Beach Club in Nassau, the Bahamas. This was important because this was the first public disclosure of what I had been hearing for a few weeks now from industry insiders, that it wasn't going to be ready on time. It is scheduled, it's still scheduled to open December 22nd, 2025, which is very soon. It's roughly less than 3 weeks from now. They did cancel the first influencer preview event. That doesn't mean that they've canceled December 22nd yet. I'm sure they are working night and day to get the facility as ready as possible. This is Royal Caribbean's new private destination in Nassau, Bahamas, which is one of the larger cruise ports that their ships attend. I am booked to go February, I believe it's 10th or 9th, 2026. So I am hopeful that it will be ready by that point. But I think it's very likely that it's going to be a stretch to get this ready in December, simply based on the concrete work and the finishing work. They've done a pretty good job on Royal Caribbean social media of keeping us updated on the project. But even the most recent update I saw, there was a lot of finishing and fixture work that still had to be done. So we will stay tuned for what actually happens there. I shared a Frank Lloyd Wright house that was recently purchased by a museum to preserve it. And I wouldn't normally mention anything with architecture that has nothing to do with a pool, but this design actually has a residential, like a backyard pool in ground connected to a stream. I have a lot of questions about how that works, even if it's on private property or an acreage out in the woods. Is it tap water, fresh water, unchlorinated water, not sanitized water? I don't know. Lots of questions. IAPA Expo, which I attended a couple weeks ago, might have been just 2 weeks ago now, time flies. They came out with their attendance numbers. And I think there is definitely a spin story happening here because they talked about roughly, they shared, I think it was like 37,000 people attended, but 42,000 people were registered. And that is a huge disparity in terms of registration versus attendance. And that's also significantly less than the attendance last year, 2024. They broke previous attendance records. So I thought it was really interesting to see the actual numbers at IAPA because having myself gone to IAPA, it was literally in the midst of the US government shutdown and the issues with the air traffic controllers being federal employees and going to work unpaid for almost 2 months. So I'm not weighing in on the political correctness of why it happened, should it have happened. But when it did happen, they did have to cut almost 15% of flights at 40 large US airports. And that included 3 major Florida airports that were adjacent to IAPA, which takes place in Orlando. So I myself, flying from Canada, was very aware that there was a chance I would not get to IAPA at all. My flight would be canceled or delayed. And so I made plans just to not go to IAPA, that I would abandon the conference if I couldn't get there on my scheduled flight. Now, I would imagine people coming from much further than I did. It was already a 17-hour day for me to go from Calgary to Toronto to Orlando. It's just what it takes to get to Florida. If you were coming from somewhere like Germany or Hong Kong or the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa region, you're spending 24, 30 hours to travel to the United States. And then you don't know if your flight is going to be delayed or canceled or sit on the runway waiting for a gate and clearance. That is very unreasonable to expect people to just hope for the best and plan for the worst. So I suspect, this is only my personal interpretation, I don't have anything to back this up, but based on my own experience on the trade show floor, and it felt empty, I really think basically more than 10% of people decided just to abandon their registration because they knew that IAPA happens every single year in Orlando. There's also regional IAPAs. So there was an IAPA in Europe, in Barcelona, in September, October. There's going to be an IAPA Middle East Expo coming up in Abu Dhabi at the end of March. There's also going to be one in LATAM. I believe it's in Mexico City, coming up in June, July. So there are plenty of other opportunities to engage with brands and suppliers that you're interested in. But the reason I'm sharing all of this lengthy information about IAPA is this does also lead to an article that's actually coming up in next week's newsletter. I read it just today or yesterday, but we are still noticing a slowdown in dry amusement. So amusement parks are still disclosing, numbers in 2025 were down. Revenue or spending per attendee might have been up, but the general numbers were down. And I think respectfully, that really reflects what we've seen in Canada the last year. And now it's going to the US, where people have been really struggling with the economy, gas prices, tariffs, supply chain. People are burnt out, they're tired, they're trying to make their regular bill payments, they're trying to fund their kids, and they just don't have the money to spend on vacation, recreation, or any sort of disposable income to go to an amusement park for hundreds of dollars. So that is one of the things I want us to be aware of in aquatics. Aquatics may only be a $6, a $10, a $12 admission expense. It may only be a $60 or $70 swim lesson, may only be a $400 or $500, youth sport fee. But I wonder if at the end of 2025, when you're looking at your revenues, when you're looking at your attendance and your costs, I wonder if revenue is going to be down for you, even if only a little bit, 5 or 10%, but that can still add up. And I do wonder if expenses are going to be up for you substantially, because I know as a Canadian company with the strong US dollar, we have a lot of supplies that we cannot avoid purchasing in US dollars. And our US dollar costs have gone up hugely over the last 18, 20 months. I know the high US dollar is good for the economy worldwide, but it has definitely been a struggle for our company, as it might be for other Canadian pools who are purchasing items from the US as well as maybe from overseas, the euro. Couple other articles I shared. There was an announcement from Courtney, BC, regarding they're going to be replacing their outdoor pool that's almost 60 years old. The cost for that is $32.5 million. What I should have said that I didn't think at the time is I think that is going to be the new baseline outdoor pool cost here in Canada for projects in 2027, 2028, 2029, and going on. You used to be able to do a basic outdoor pool for $8 to $10 million. And I'm thinking back, this was COVID times, projects that I was connected to in 2021, 2022. That was very competitive pricing. Financing was very competitive. The US dollar wasn't as strong. A lot of projects and contractors, their work schedule was sluggish, so you could get better pricing. But I genuinely think going forward, if we're talking about replacement of an outdoor pool where you're demoing, you're doing earthworks, you're doing infrastructure, you're building a change room like a bathhouse, I don't think $32 million is far off what we're going to be averaging. And I'm not somebody who does costing on projects. That is just my feeling reading into the location and the story. There was an article I shared regarding a babysitter who was charged regarding a 2-year-old who drowned in a pond nearby. If you've been here for a while, you know I don't love to share articles where people are charged. But in cases where there is actually a contract or it's their business to care for children, whether that is a daycare, a babysitter, like there's a formal relationship, I do think that it is reasonable to expect there to be some accountability to care for children. I don't have all the details, but that is the primary reason that I included that story in this week's newsletter. Another story I included in this week's newsletter was from Verdun, which is basically Montreal, Quebec. And the coroner in a drowning fatality in that location found that the signage on the beach incorrectly stated that the beach was being monitored by lifeguards at a time and location that it was not. So that is very, very bad for the municipality. They have since corrected it. They've since said that the signage has been updated or the lifeguard zones have been redrawn. But I would not be surprised if we see some sort of legal action from the family for something like this, because thinking that you're being lifeguarded and then not being lifeguarded is definitely cause for concern for some people. That's why they choose to swim where they choose to swim. I shared a interesting story out of India. I believe it was in India, where there was basically a competitive swim meet at an outdoor pool that was not heated and the weather was not great. And the pool ended up dropping to 17 Celsius, which is pretty cold. I would say 60s Fahrenheit. And the athletes were still expected to swim and compete in this colder pool, when FINA, World Aquatic, requires minimum temperatures for safe and effective competitive swimming. I'm not really deep into the competitive swim world. I was not a competitive swimmer, but I do stay connected to these stories because it is something to consider in terms of utility costs and design costs. I'm often ragging on colleagues in the southern US. Like, I don't understand if you live somewhere like Georgia or Florida or Texas or Arizona, where respectfully it doesn't get that cold in the off season in the fall winter, why wouldn't you install a gas heater and extend your season just a little bit? There is a cost certainly to running a gas line, to buying a heater, to heating the water. I'm not suggesting you use your outdoor pool year round, but I've always wondered some of these projects where at the time of construction, we're talking a pretty negligible amount of additional cost for extending your season several months. And this is an extreme case of where using, the event was booked at the pool, it's not heated. And then what do you do if you need the water to be heated to a certain temperature? I'm tracking a law that's been proposed in Florida regarding vacation rentals for pools, in terms of a safety bill that would be great if, because Florida, there's lots of families who go and rent homes. They may have pools. They may come from states or regions that don't have backyard pools. I think this is really important. But with any law, the readings and getting it passed and signed, it's a very lengthy process. So I don't want to get my hopes up. Florida is a very tourist-focused state, and the lobby there may not feel that this is beneficial to tourism. Some people may feel that it creates unrealistic or unfair burdens on homeowners. So we'll have to wait and see. Lastly, I did share something that was a bit of a red herring for me, but I'm here to learn and I want to share that learning with you. I was reading a trade publication more geared towards the pool residential construction industry and service industry, and they were talking about bomb awareness. So I didn't realize that a bunch of the chemicals that we use in swimming pools can also be used to build a bomb, apparently. And so there was some awareness that if you work in the industry and you notice, I guess, somebody buying lots of amounts of chemicals and they don't have a pool or they don't work in the pool industry, that there are restrictions on that. The same way that, or rather, there's not restrictions like from an education and awareness and observation perspective to be aware of that hazard. the same way when we lived in New Mexico briefly. There was some sort of restriction. I don't remember the exact medication, but when you went to the pharmacy, the drugstore, you couldn't purchase, was it Benadryl, or there you could only buy one bottle or one package per person per day. And those could also be used. I think it wasn't for bombs, though. I want to say it was for like crack or meth or something like that. There was a reason you couldn't buy more than one bottle per person per day at that pharmacy. So the things you learn that I definitely did not know. And then, as always, at the end of the newsletter, I shared 2 videos. I shared last week's audio version of the newsletter. And then I did share, I've got some smaller videos I filmed during the summer that I've just gotten around to releasing. This is a classic activity that I've done at a lot of different pools for a lot of different leadership courses and in service. And it is 100 ways to say good job. It's super easy. All you need is pen and paper or whiteboard marker. 5 minutes, a couple people. Strongly recommend you give that video a watch and think about, it's a quick activity you can have in your back pocket to incorporate the next time you have some dead time and you want to get people collaborating and working together. That's it for this week. Thank you so much for joining me for this discussion of the December 3rd, 2025 newsletter. I will be back next week. We're going to be back on December 10th and December 17th. We are going to be taking Christmas Eve, December 24th off. And then I will be back at the end of the month, December 31st, with our 2025 Aquatic Industry News year-end recap. I also will be sharing in the first week of January 2026 the findings from our sexual harassment survey in aquatics. A few people asked what was happening with this. I've not buried it. I'm not ignoring it. I'm not disrespecting the value of sharing the information. I have just been completely slammed the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks. I have roughly 4 facilities opening in 3.5 months. That's not meant to be an excuse. It's just very unusual that at this time of the year, I'm so busy. Usually things are tapering very nicely into Christmas and some heavy time off. So I'm just trying to manage my workload as best as I can, while also acknowledging I need to give this information adequate time and credit that it's due. So the best thing for me to do is to launch that January 7th. And I will be on a cruise. So I will get that done before I go on the cruise. And then I will also record a video. We'll chat about it further. And then probably we'll pick up some more data because people may have responses or comments or further things that they want to add. So thank you so much for being here. And I will catch you same time next week. Bye for now.